to Surrender School, the Gifts of Imperfection Book Club. Session 1.
Welcome, everybody. I'm really glad to see everyone. I'm glad you're here. I'm excited about doing this book. One of the things that, that we need to make really clear, this isn't an OA meeting, nor is this an official book. And I have an older version, by the way. It's not a conference-approved book, and it's not really even a book about addiction recovery. But the way that I'm going to present this material is through the lens of recovery. So that's what I'm going to be talking about when I'll read some sections, I'll make some comments, but I'm going to be putting it through the lens of our 12 steps and our recovery process. And it really actually fits really, really well. And if you know anything about Brené Brown, you know that she's in recovery. She's been in recovery for about 25 years. And so she comes from a background of that. And so sometimes you'll see in the reading, you'll see a little thing that sounds like something we would see in a meeting, or we'd hear in a meeting. So the other caveat that I want to say is that I'm in no way an expert. I'm just another bozo on the bus. And so if something I say doesn't make sense to you or doesn't resonate or whatever, ignore it. So I'm going to start right off in the preface on Roman numeral 9, which is IX. Okay. And I love this statement. This very first line, once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. Trust me, I've tried. But when the same truth keeps repeating itself, it's hard to pretend that it's just a coincidence. I think, I've heard a lot of times in meetings about how OA ruins binging, right? Because once you start learning this stuff, you can't unlearn it, and it becomes a part of you. And it ruins binging. It doesn't necessarily stop us from doing it, but it's harder to zone out and really just do it because we know that there's another way. The next thing I want to read is it's the next paragraph down, where she says, one reason it's impossible to unsee trends is that our minds are engineered to seek out patterns and to assign meaning to them. Humans are a meaning-making species. And one of the things that I think is really important is that step 10 really, really showed me this. In going, doing step 10s, multiple step 10s a day, it shows me that I'm not always right in the way that I assign meaning. Okay. I may be a meaning-making machine, but I'm not always right. Okay. And also meaning is very important. And recovery has given my life meaning and purpose. And I make meaning out of working with other people. I make meaning out of doing these kinds of book studies and things. And recovery is a perfect way of doing that. And all through the big book, you see Bill talk about that when he talks about being rocketed into the fourth dimension, and that, his life had purpose and meaning like never before. And that's one of the promises of step 9 is having purpose. Okay, so then on the next page, she says about a third of the way down, but in this huge mound of data, there was also story after story of men and women who were living these amazing and inspiring lives. I heard stories about the power of embracing imperfection and vulnerability. Learned about the inextricable connection between joy and gratitude, and how things that I take for granted, like rest and play, are as vital to our health as nutrition and exercise. These research participants trusted themselves, and they talked about authenticity and love and belonging in a way that was completely new to me. We come into program, we see people living lives that we didn't even think were possible, right? And they were living without excess food, and they were doing so happily, right? And that is something that kind of way of living was so outside of my own way of thinking that I never even considered that it was possible. And so, she's talking about people who are living wholehearted lives here. And I'm talking about people who are living actively in recovery, but it's kind of the same thing. Okay. Next, it's just the next paragraph. She said, I wanted to look at these stories as a whole, so I grabbed a file and a Sharpie, and I wrote the first word that came to my mind on the tab, wholehearted. I would say recovered, right? I had lots of questions about wholeheartedness. What did these folks value? How did they create all this resilience in their lives? What were their main concerns, and how did they resolve or address them? Can anyone create a wholehearted life? What does it take to cultivate what we need? And for me, most importantly, what gets in the way? You could replace the word wholehearted with the word recovered, right? And these were the kinds of questions that I had when I came into program. How the hell are you people doing this, right? How are you doing this? I wanted to know. And I knew you knew because you were doing it, right? Okay, next on page Roman numeral 11, XI, toward the middle, she writes, after studying tough topics like shame for a decade, I truly believed that I deserved confirmation that I was living right. But here's the tough lesson that I learned that day and every day since. How much we know and understand ourselves is critically important, but there is something that is even more essential to living a wholehearted life: loving ourselves. And I will tell you that I found that really digging into the steps, really digging into the spirituality of this program has begun teaching me to love myself. It is certainly not an event. It's not a switch I flipped, but it's something I'm learning how to do slowly but surely. And sometimes I even like myself, which is amazing to me, absolutely amazing to me. She goes on to say, next paragraph, same page, knowledge is important, but only if we're being kind and gentle with ourselves as we work to discover who we are. Wholeheartedness is as much about embracing our tenderness and vulnerability as it is about developing knowledge and claiming power. And perhaps the most painful lesson of that day hit me so hard that it took my breath away. It is clear from the data that we cannot give our children what we don't have. Tenderness and vulnerability, quite frankly, are what allow me to connect to my fellows in program and to my sponsees in particular. Tenderness and vulnerability. Big Book talks about it. What is it? Emotional, frothy appeal seldom suffices, right? Our message has to have depth and weight. Tenderness and vulnerability. We cannot give what we don't have, period. I know, because I've tried. It doesn't work. And that goes for our children, our sponsees, and ourselves. I can't give my sponsees love, understanding, compassion, unless I'm able to give it to myself. And I think sometimes the negative experiences that some folks have had with sponsors who are very controlling and punishing and critical, I think it's because those people have not found love, forgiveness, and compassion for themselves, and therefore they're not able to give it to their sponsees. All right, next page, very top of it, very first line on Roman numeral 12. This journey is equal parts heart work and head work. You know, I've often heard it said, I couldn't agree with this more. I've often heard it said like that you have to shut up and do everything that your sponsor tells you to do or other people in program tell you to do. And that didn't work for me because that required me to shut off my head. And when I did that, I could do what people were saying to me for a little while. But if I didn't bring my understanding, which is head, down into my heart, I couldn't sustain what they were telling me to do because I was only complying. I wasn't making it mine.
So the marriage of heart work and head work is extremely important.
Later on the same page, a little bit further down, a couple paragraphs down, she says, it was a long year. I lovingly refer to it on my blog as the 2007 spiritual awakening. It felt like a textbook breakdown to me, but Diana, her therapist, called it a spiritual awakening. And I love that Dr. Brown equates her spiritual awakening with a breakdown. Because I think it's important for us to recognize that spiritual awakenings are not always roses and daffodils, right? Sometimes it hurts, and sometimes it hurts a lot. And then, you know, after I experience it and I go through that hurt, then I'm able to see what that hurt has taught me, how if I've grown with it. You know, I'm not knocking mountaintop experiences as spiritual experiences. In fact, that's my preference. I love a good mountaintop experience. But I'll tell you that a lot of them have hurt. And they do feel like a little mini breakdown to me. So when I'm in the middle of the pain, it doesn't always mean that something's wrong. Sometimes it means that a spiritual awakening has started. And sometimes people who've really hurt me have been the biggest gifts for my spiritual awakenings. Sometimes I don't know those blessings until afterwards, you know, after I'm done feeling like I want to, you know, smack them in the face. That I can really see that was the beginning of a spiritual awakening for me. So I'm really glad that she brings that up. Then later on that same page, last paragraph, she says, people may call what happens at midlife a crisis, but it's not. It's an unraveling, a time when you feel a desperate pull to live the life you want to live, not the one you're supposed to live. The unraveling is a time when you are challenged by the universe to let go of who you think you are supposed to be and embrace who you are. You know, I love that she lists recovery as an example of an unraveling. I absolutely love that. Bill W. wrote about that in the big book on page 42, when he says, quote, it meant I would have to throw several lifelong conceptions out of the window. You know, and one of the biggest conceptions I had to throw out the window was that recovery in this program didn't mean I was going to learn how to eat one piece of pizza and then be able to stop. I had to let go of that conception that recovery meant I could control my food. And I had to embrace the fact that recovery meant I didn't eat pizza in the first place. And that was something that I really had to come to terms with, because I thought y'all were going to teach me how to eat one cookie and stop. That just never happened for me. Okay, next, on the bottom of Roman numeral page 13, next to last paragraph, it says, I'm sorry if these pages are different. I just saw something scroll through and it looks like someone's translating for me, which I'm really appreciative of. So thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. tells you how long I've had this book and how long I've wanted to read it, and I never did. Okay. I learned how to worry more about how I felt and less about what people might think. I was setting new boundaries and began to let go of my need to please, perform, and perfect. I started saying no rather than sure and being resentful and pissed off later. I began to say, oh, hell yes, rather than sounds fun, but I have a lot of work to do, or I'll do that when I'm, obviously for us, it's thinner. When I'm thinner, I'll do that. When I can fit into size 4, I'll do that, right? And that's exactly the same kinds of stuff that I learned in recovery. I'm learning how to set boundaries. I'm learning how to say no when I mean no. I am learning that what other people think of me is not nearly as important as how I think about me. And I think that, and I think there's so much people pleasing that gets in the way of our recovery in this program. And I think a lot of it happens in the sponsorship relationship. And we need to think about sponsors and sponsees as equals. We're both on this road together, right? There's no hierarchy there. Nobody knows anything more than anyone else. Somebody is just a little further along on the path. And so it doesn't matter what your sponsor thinks of you. What do you think of you, right? Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is on Roman numeral 14, XIV, or whatever it is in the new version. Mid-page, on that faithful November day, when the list appeared and I sunk into the realization that I wasn't living and loving with my whole heart, I wasn't totally convinced. Seeing the list wasn't enough to fully believe in it. I had to dig very deep and make the conscious choice to believe. The conscious choice to believe in myself and the possibility of living a different life. I couldn't recover just going through the motions of the program and waiting for it to happen. I had to make the conscious choice to believe I could recover and that I could have a better life. Nothing happened until I did that. And that's because I needed to take 100% responsibility for making it happen with my higher power's help. Okay. As long as I was just going through the motions, as long as I was checking off the boxes, nothing happened for me. I had to make the conscious choice that this was going to work and that I was going to consciously make the choice to believe that I could recover, even, and you don't know my story, but even though I just spent the last 20 plus years in relapse. And so and with multiple tries at recovery, this was probably my, I don't know, I'd been in program for 30 years. It was probably my 50th attempt at recovery, right? And I had to believe that this time I could recover. And that had to be a conscious choice of mine. If I'd have believed everything that previous experience had taught me, I wouldn't have believed that. Last thing I want to talk about in this first part is the second to last paragraph. I now see how owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing that we will ever do. I now see that cultivating a wholehearted life is not like trying to reach a destination. It's like walking toward a star in the sky. We never really arrive, but we certainly know that we're headed in the right direction. I now see how gifts like courage, compassion, and connection only work when they are exercised every day, just like the steps. I now see how the work of cultivating and letting go that shows up in the 10 guideposts is not to-do list material. It's not something we accomplish or acquire and then check off our list. It's life work. It's soul work. For me, believing was seeing. Soul work. That's what I believe recovery is. That's what I believe step work is soul work. Amen. Living steps 10, 11, and 12. I love that. I'm all fired up now. Okay. So then I want to move to the introduction chapter. Okay. And I don't know, in my book, it's page 1. It's the very first paragraph. Wholehearted living is about engaging in our lives from a place of worthiness. It means cultivating the courage, compassion, and connection to wake up in the morning and think, no matter what gets done and how much is left undone, I am enough. It's going to bed at night thinking, yes, I am imperfect and vulnerable and sometimes afraid, but that doesn't change the truth that I am also brave and worthy of love and belonging. I think our fellows in program really help us with this when we first come in. At least that was my experience. Because when I came in, I really hated myself and I really didn't have any belief in myself. And I really leaned heavily on my fellows to help me see something different about myself. It was how my higher power started to change the way that I looked at myself, was looking through my fellows' eyes. That was really important for me. The next is where she says, wholehearted living is not a one-time choice. It's a process. In fact, I believe it's the journey of a lifetime, and it's our daily process. It's our daily reprieve, right? It's one day at a time in this process. A little bit further down on the same page, before embarking on any journey, including this one, including recovery, it's important to talk about what we need to bring along. What does it take to live and love from a place of worthiness? How do we embrace imperfection? How do we cultivate what we need and let go of the things that are holding us back? The answers to all these questions are courage, compassion, and connection. And she lists the tools: courage, compassion, and connection. For me, it was the courage to move forward, even though I was afraid of recovery. Well, no, I wasn't afraid of recovery. I was afraid of yet another failure at recovery. It was compassion for myself as an addict. I'm an addict. I didn't choose to be an addict. This is just a fact of the way that I was made. And I've got to have compassion for the fact that I had to have compassion for the fact that I had been in OA for 30 years and had been in relapse for like 26 of them, 25 of them. I came in, I got recovery. I was in recovery for a number of years. I relapsed and I stayed relapsed for 20 plus years before I got recovery again. So I really had to have a lot of compassion for myself. And it was connection with my fellows and my higher power and my fellow addicts, okay, that allowed me to feel like I belonged, that I was worthy of being there, that I was worthy of trying for recovery again, even though I had failed over and over and over again. It gave me the courage not to give up. Next page, toward the top, because we're human and so beautifully imperfect, we get to practice using our tools on a daily basis. You know, I think we get really weirded out in this program around perfection with our food plans. Like my abstinence, I am perfectly abstinent from my alcoholic foods. My food plan is a tool I use that I'm not always perfect at. But I am perfect with my abstinence from my alcoholic foods, because otherwise I dive right back into the disease if I don't abstain from those alcoholic foods. But I am beautifully imperfect in everything else I do in this program. Absolutely everything else I do in this program. Okay, then the next page, page 3 toward the bottom under the digging deep section, where she says the dig deep button is a secret level of pushing through when we're exhausted and overwhelmed and when there's too much to do and too little time for self-care. And then on the next page, the last sentence of the next paragraph, maybe there was something better than just sucking it up. Now, for me, when I'm stressed or overwhelmed, the very first thing to go is my self-care, right? When I'm and that's actually, though, the time that I need to do my self-care the most. And I will tell you that my first cue that something is amiss in my program is when I miss my morning quiet time. When I tell myself that I do not have time for my morning quiet time, I am bullshitting myself. I am making excuses. I'm telling myself I'm too busy for that kind of self-care. I can't be abstinent and work this program unless I have that time with my higher power first thing in the morning. It could be 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be 3 hours in the lotus position, but 5 minutes of checking in with my higher power is enough. Next, she talks about, here is what I found. Men and women who live wholeheartedly do indeed dig deep. They just do it in a different way. Instead of forcing themselves to go through when they feel like they're exhausted, what they do is they get deliberate in their thoughts and behavior through prayer, meditation, or simply setting their intentions. They get inspired to make new and different choices, and they get going. They take action. Doesn't that sound familiar for program? That's my number one thing for program, is take an action. It can be the wrong action. Just take an action. Do something. Don't sit in it, because otherwise I get into self-pity. Further down, she says, do something deliberately relaxing. Find something inspired to do rather than something soul-sucking. Then last but not least, get up and just do it. And what I do, trying to find something restorative, I really had to work at finding something that was very nurturing to myself. A lot of times these stress management things, they all tell you to get up and exercise and do stuff like that. That's like the last thing I want to do. I want to do something that really feels like I'm doing something special for myself. Sometimes that's getting a special cup of tea, wrapping up in a nice warm blanket and reading a trashy novel. Something that feels like I don't let myself do it very often, so that it's special to me. And that's nurturing. Forcing myself to go lift weights would be soul sucking. It wouldn't be restorative to me. Now, for some people, it really is, but that's just not my story. Okay, and then let's see. The next thing I want to talk about is on page 5 toward the middle. We can talk about courage and love and compassion until we sound like a greeting card store. But unless we're willing to have an honest conversation about what gets in the way of putting these into practice in our daily lives, we will never change. Never, ever. Courage sounds great, but we need to talk about how it requires us to let go of what other people think. And for most of us, that's scary. Compassion is something we all want, but are we willing to look at why boundary setting and saying no is a critical component of compassion? Are we willing to say no even if we're disappointing someone? Belonging is an essential component of wholehearted living, but first, we have to cultivate self-acceptance. Why is this such a struggle? Just face it. We can't keep doing the same shit and expecting things to be different, okay? And Dr. Brown lists some of the obstacles using these 3 tools, but there are so many obstacles and blocks for my recovery in this program. One of them is being bullied, that sometimes I see in program that happens. Sometimes I see there's judgment that I see in this program. That is an obstacle. We have to find our tribe and program that can support us in order to do this, so that we can do it in the most loving, courageous, and compassionate way. And for me, that took some time. I had a lot of blocks because I failed so many times trying to recover. And yet I thought I knew how to do it, right? And I would just try harder and try harder and try harder instead of trying something new. And it takes courage to try something new with our programs. Particularly, I could quote chapter and verse out of the big book, but could I stay abstinent? No. So it was really important to me to figure out those blocks. And for me personally, it had a lot to do with higher power, and I had to do a lot of work around that. And then everything kind of came together for me. So the last thing I want to talk about is on the last page of that introduction chapter, the last paragraph. Owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy. The experiences that make us the most vulnerable, only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. And to me, it sums up programs so beautifully. As long as I was running away from the pain of what it took for me to get into recovery, I couldn't recover. I had to accept it, embrace it, go through it, and then it lifted. And I was able to get into recovery. So that's all I've got for today.
See you next week.